Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us to talk about the Bulgarian elections, which happened just this past Sunday. My name is Joanna Rzańska, and I'm the Resident Program Director for IRI's Brussels office. And we have had the pleasure of cooperating with the Center for Study with CSD in Bulgaria in monitoring the media surrounding the elections in the past couple of weeks, which you can follow on our site. So elections in Bulgaria came on Sunday. Turnout was a historic low due to a double blow of a cresting third COVID wave and adverse weather, but turnout was remarkably high among the sizable Bulgarian diaspora. The OSCE did determine that fundamental freedoms were respected in these elections, but unsurprisingly, massive use of state resources did give the ruling party a significant change. That being said, we might be entering a new era in Bulgarian politics. With 98% of the votes counted, the ruling GERB party of Prime Minister Boyko Borisov came out ahead, but only garnering 24% of the votes so far. And in contrast to that, anti-establishment parties made significant gains, likely cresting on the protests that kind of gripped the country last summer and certainly have posed the single biggest challenge to GERB's 12-year hold on power. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Thibault Muzergues, who very kindly offered to moderate the discussion with Mr. Ruslan Stefanov, who is the head of CSD in Sofia. So Thibault, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and it's great to be with you all to talk about these very important elections that maybe didn't get enough publicity in Europe and in America as they deserved. But we are here to make it better with this conversation. And I would love to start, Ruslan, by basically we're going to divide this discussion or this duet, so to speak, into three parts. We're going to talk about election, we're going to talk about corruption, and we're going to talk about direction. So the first step is obviously to discuss the results of the election. I think Joanna has set the stage very well on what has happened, but I'd like to go a little bit more in the details and to go into the analysis, because it's difficult at this stage to say, who's won. We know some people who have lost, but it's difficult to say exactly who won and who lost the election. So I would like Ruslan to have your take on that, because we saw that GERB lost support, but it lost support less than the Socialists and still ahead of every other party. Stefanov made a remarkable entry into the parliament. I think this is the best score for a first entrant. It is the best score ever for a first-time party, with the exception of Emmanuel Macron, who actually was first, and Emmanuel Macron's party came up first. And then the other thing that Joanna didn't mention, but I'm sure she's very interested in, is the fact that the nationalists are actually out of parliament. There are no parties to the right of GERB. So we know some of the losers, but who are the winners here, Ruslan?
Well, first of all, Thibault and Joanna, thanks for having me. I really appreciate working with IRI on a number of issues, mostly related also to Bulgaria's foreign policy orientation. And I'm also joined in the audience by my colleague, Dr. Rumana Filippova, with whom we'll work on also on these elections for the IRI. As you know, typically politics is everybody claims that they won, but there is clearly, the winning parties that Joanna rightly mentions are those that supported the protests last summer. The biggest winner is again a populist, a long-time favorite showman in the country, who also won quite a large amount of support with and becoming the second force in parliament with close to 18%. Or they will have like 50+ plus 53, 52 seats in a 240 people parliament. The other party that won and clearly did better, the coalition Da Bulgaria, which is a coalition of what people here refer to the to the urban right of center intellectuals. There is a coalition of three parties, including Greens, and they polled about 5 or 6%, but they managed to win close to 10% of the vote and will have about 30 people in parliament, similar to one of the smallest, actually, kind of establishment party, which is the Turkish minority party, DPS. So these two parties, together with the third smaller coalition called Rise or Stand Up BG, thugs out, we have all very much difficulty translating all these new names, like the second party that won of Slavi Trifonov, who is this showman, it's called There Is Such a People, which does not necessarily sound translatable into English or other languages, but these three parties are clearly the winners because they got more votes than was expected. In particular, Slavi Trifonov's party, ITN, or There Is Such a People, they entered parliament on second place. At the same time, the parliament is one of the, it's not the most, but it's still pretty much atomized. The largest party will have GERB, will have 75 seats, and even the mathematics of putting parties together is very, very, very difficult in actually coming along with a majority. So there are all sorts of speculations, but from what we see, the most likely one, and already GERB, Borisov, the current prime minister, announced that he'll be happy to continue in some form managing the crisis, as he mentions it. I don't think many people want to see that, because clearly there was an overwhelming no vote. And this no vote was particularly well expressed among the people outside of the country, who have clearly left the country because they don't find employment and opportunity here in the country. But this was probably the largest participation, and they voted for the first place. They put ITN, or There Is No Such a People. Second place was for Da Bulgaria. Third place was for the Turkish minority party because of the votes from Turkey, and Borisov and his GERB came only fourth. So this is, I mean, if we take the votes only of the people outside of the country, then we would have had much more different dynamics. So this is in a nutshell what we have. The biggest loser, if one has to look at that, the biggest loser is the Socialist Party. I mean, they have half the votes they got during the last parliament. And clearly, although GERB is also losing, I mean, they lost much less with 300,000 votes, roughly. They lost much less, and they didn't lose their status of the first political party than the Socialist. And it's exactly the Socialists that are expected to play a role, to try to lend a hand to There Is Such a People, to try to form a government, or at least some sort of an expert government. So if I have to make this prediction, although I think it's very, very, very uncertain, I would go with the highest likelihood from the current point of view is that they will have quick rush second, elections this year, probably, maybe in the autumn with the presidential elections, and number two, will probably have some sort of an expert government inspired or started by There Is Such a People, together with Da Bulgaria, which means Yes Bulgaria, and with the tacit support of the Bulgarian Socialist Party. But this will be a very, very unstable majority. So I would expect that they might be able to do that only if there is very clear if there is very clear policy in terms of doing managing the pandemics. Because Bulgaria, like Joanna mentioned, a lot of the people that didn't go to vote did so because they were scared, because Bulgaria is right in the middle of the third wave. There were no, Bulgaria has the least vaccinated people as a share of the population across the EU. And that, of course, put people off. So this is, in a nutshell, what my prediction was a little bit, going a little bit deeper in. I'm not sure I responded to all your questions, but I hope that I did.
No, pretty much so, and indeed you mentioned the victory of Bulgaria, which I mean the great results of Bulgaria, which obviously is coming as a surprise. I'd like to go back to this coalition building because obviously we are in a situation, as you said, in which it is a very we have a very atomized parliament, which is something that we see pretty much everywhere. The prospects of new elections is something that we see in plenty of countries. I think the most spectacularly has been in Israel over the past couple of years, in which basically people have been every 6 months have had to go back to the polls. So, I mean, I understand that the number 2 and number 4 parties, so there is such a people, and Bulgaria could come together to form a coalition, but the thing is that the 2 of them altogether are barely above the number of votes, in terms of votes I'm talking, they're barely above the number of votes that GERB received. GERB got 25% of the votes, something like that. So, I mean, how does that, I mean, is it just a question right now of getting rid of Boyko Borisov, because he's the person that has been dominating Bulgarian politics for the past 10 years, and he's seen by a number of politicians as the problem. But how do you even keep 6 months having a government that has so little support in parliament? Because even if it's a tacit support from the Bulgarian Socialist Party, they have been beaten resoundingly. They're not even in second place. I mean, how do you see the dynamic in the 6 months coming up? And I would also say, how does the government get formed at all? In how do they jockey for influence? I mean, it's going to be a very tough job, right, forming a government.
Absolutely. I mean, let me say that, again, my first choice is I think there will be new elections, just like in Israel. There are some clear things, and there's a lot of unclear things. The clear thing is that all the 5 parties except GERB have expressed clearly their disliking of Borisov and GERB. So that is something that unites everybody outside of GERB. Now, this, I think, is not enough, as you mentioned. If the second and the fourth party, so if ITN, Slavi Trifonov and Bulgaria, if they join forces, as you mentioned, even if the socialists come in, that will not be enough. They will need still the last party, the smallest party, which is an offshoot and previously has been part of the Socialist Party. So they might join formally. And also ITN, the Slavi Trifonov's people, the second party, they've said that they can work only with these 2, only with Bulgaria and with Rise Up Bulgaria, Rise Up BG. So in that respect, what everybody's waiting for is essentially what ITN are going to say, but they say nothing. I mean, essentially, they've been absent from the debates. They haven't participated in a single debate throughout the campaign. Slavi Trifonov just had 1 public appearance, talking with his fans, and even there he didn't provide any questions. His platform, he's running on 10-point platform, and most of what he promises he cannot do in that parliament. I mean, there's no way. I mean, he needs a Grand National Assembly, which is essentially a double the current National Assembly that requires separate special votes and so on and so forth. So his willingness to reform the voting system by moving into a majoritarian system and making changes so that people could vote directly for a prosecutor general and could vote directly for regional police chiefs, that cannot happen without such grand National Assembly and without very, very difficult voting. So it's really, from what I see right now, Thibault, it's highly unlikely that this will happen. Yet Trifonov should not be underestimated. I mean, he has been around for many, many years. He certainly knows all the players, including Borisov. So he has good relations with everyone. He knows everyone. And if he decides to, he's also business oriented very much. So if he decides to focus on an expert government and calls on the diaspora to fill these, there are plenty of people out there who already have very good, professional development. They would be happy to help for 6 months or 9 months around the country. If they're able to do that, pick up a convincing prime minister, and this is going to be something, then I think the stars could align. If they have a very clear agenda of what they're going to do with the pandemics. And secondly, if they could convince, or they could start using the EU funds, because Bulgaria is currently the country with the largest per GDP or per capita allocation of EU funds in the coming years. So making these funds available in the post-COVID economy and making them work, making them attracting private investment is something that people, if an expert government could do this, then that would mean that he might be winning the next elections. And I think this is something that they will be aiming for. But it's, from what we see now, we cannot judge because there is scarce little information. And of course, the Socialist Party, as you mentioned, although they said they'll be happy to run against GERB, whatever the coalition is, they have their internal problems, so they will run into that. And of course, the Bulgaria is also a coalition. It's 3 parties. They also have different ideas about governing. So it's going to be extremely difficult, but I don't rule this out. I think if I have to assign some probabilities, I'll probably say more than 50% would be going for new elections, and then less than 50% would be the second option with an expert government run by ITN, the second party, Slavic Trifon's party, and then the third would be some sort of a political cabinet that I don't see. The ITN, they don't even have professional political people. I mean, they're newbies all around, and it will be very, very difficult to essentially run a political operation within parliament, and that's also something that Borisov alluded to.
Okay, thank you, Ruslan. And I guess this is the moment where it becomes interesting to quote Bismarck, who said about diplomacy, but I guess it goes as well for coalition making in parliament, that it's a little bit like sausage making. You want to taste it, but you certainly don't want to see how it's made. So I guess we're at this stage, and we're in this process of the sausage making. I would like to continue a little bit and move on to the other part of our conversation, which is corruption. So obviously corruption was one of the main issues, or even maybe the main issue in the political campaign, and it probably was the big mover in these votes for the new parties, whether it's Da Bulgaria, there is such a people. Obviously, this is something that people care about, and we see people protest almost every year about this in Bulgaria, and yet there seems to have been little change in terms of the Bulgaria is still ranking low in the corruption index, even in terms of also of press freedom. That Bulgaria is still ranking low inside the European Union. Where do you think this is coming from? Is it that there is no efforts coming in? Boyko Borisov, after all, was elected 10 years ago on a program that was, all about rooting corruption out of Bulgaria. Has there been no progress? Has there been too little progress? How do you analyze things?
Well, this is one of the paramount topics of Bulgarian elections, and actually of elections across Central and Eastern Europe, I should say. I mean, if you look at Slovakia, it's a very similar case. Croatia, similarly. Bulgaria has this image, of course. If we look at the numbers, Bulgaria is not worse than the top 5 worst countries in the EU. Yet, what is really particular about Bulgaria and Borisov in particular, and which brought, I think, so many people united against GERB, was that after 2010, so after the first 2 years of their mandate, and Bulgaria, remember, Bulgaria was part of it still is part of the mechanism that the European Commission imposed upon Bulgaria joining the EU, because the Commission said Bulgaria doesn't have the mechanisms to ensure rule of law and anti-corruption and judiciary that play, that uphold that rule of law. This is still in place. But this mechanism, called the cooperation verification mechanism, had a preclusion clause. I mean, it could punish Bulgaria until 2010. And essentially, this is when Borisov decided to close this chapter and not open it anymore. I mean, essentially, since 2010, he completely disregarded anything of good governance and anti-corruption. And I think this, in the end of the day, animated people so much against him. If you remember, this had foreign policy repercussions, meaning that the 2 projects that we stopped, South Stream and Belene, the 2 corrupt Russian projects that Borisov stopped in 2012, his first government, he reopened in his 3rd government and actually pushed through. And now we have Turk Stream in Bulgaria. And we have also the reactors of Belene, the nuclear power plants, the Russian reactors. So that was very, very clear, and everybody saw that. These are billions of euros of Bulgarian taxpayers' money, which means people see this. You know, when you speak about not being able to raise the salaries of frontline medics, or discussing whether this should be with 400 euros or 500 euros, you know, clearly this agitates people very much. That's number one. Number two, there is very clearly a lack of investment, of private investment in Bulgaria. Okay, there is EU funds, and it's enough for the country to grow, but there are no private funds, which means private businesses don't come because there is no fair competition. I mean, essentially, corruption was substituted with something we call state capture. I mean, you don't have to corrupt, but you cannot even participate in public procurement if you're not part of the circle of companies. And this model of circle of companies was designed and was first opened up and explained, by the way, paradoxically, and this is something that you don't know, by the honorary chair of the Turkish Minority Party, Ahmet Dogan, in the studio of Slavi Trifonov. So Slavi Trifonov is not newbie to what exactly is happening in Bulgaria. So it would be very interesting to see what policies he might propose in that respect, because he clearly is not, is not a newbie in terms of how business is done in Bulgaria. And of course, in terms of corruption, Bulgaria hasn't really designed any honest, forward-looking, coherent policy. It's been all the time, it has been spin, 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 spin. So Borisov has tried essentially to take over that policy and spin it around, meaning we did everything about corruption. We did there is no corruption essentially. There is no contraband, which is true, but the thing is that it's state capture. It's worse. Yes, you don't pay bribes. Yes, bribery really declined. But the reason it declined was that you're simply out of the system if you're not part of the circle of trust, if you're not part of the circle of companies. You cannot bid for public procurement if you don't know that you're going to win. And that was, of course, and I'm finishing with that, but that's, of course, also part of the EU problem. I think it's a wider issue, and that also links to, we might discuss later on, that also links to the inroads of Russia and China. The EU problem is that they turn, they essentially, they decided at some point after the financial crisis, and the difficulties with Poland and Hungary, they turned their gaze away. Essentially they said, oh, whatever. I mean, Bulgaria, Borisov doesn't make any waves. He is a partner of the European People's Party. So why bother, indeed, when you have even worse transgressors like Orban or Poland? So in that respect, Bulgaria was left, outside of this external conditionality. And clearly, so far, looking back at the past 30 years of anti-corruption campaigning in Bulgaria, Bulgaria hasn't been able to sustain an anti-corruption momentum without this external conditionality, without some sort of a push, of a help, the way that the EU now finally started to realize doing with Orban. And I think this is going to be also critical in terms of helping Bulgaria resolve these issues. But as we speak, there are all these, the difficulties, not so much with the bribery, although it could flourish very quickly. If we look at for example, one of the most recent examples was the Pfizer vaccine. Clearly, it went into all these circles of trust and corrupt circles. This is also something that cost Borisov some of the votes in the last months of this election.
Okay, well, you made my transition, so that's perfect. I would like to move on to talk about direction now, and by direction I mean foreign policy, of course. We've talked a little bit about Europe, about Bulgaria's position in Europe. Maybe let's try to look at things a bit more geopolitically. And I saw that my colleague Jan Sorocak asked you a question on the chat, which I encourage you all to please start asking your questions now. Send them in writing, and we'll be able to discuss them in a few minutes. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about Bulgaria's position right now. And I mean, the least we can say is that the current positioning of Bulgaria, geographic positioning, is not an easy one. There is Russia, which is making inroads, both in terms of the private sector. I think the biggest company in the country is actually Lukoil. You have many Russians who are buying real estate. There's a lot of Russian disinformation that's using pan-Slavism, etc., etc. There is Turkey at the door, which is probably one of the reasons why Bulgaria gets a pass in the European Union every once in a while, because there is a border, and there is always the question of refugees and migrants that's popping up. And then there's the West, and Bulgaria has made that choice of the West. There was a road towards the West, which sort of ended with Bulgaria's integration first into NATO and then in the European Union. Now that the destination is reached, there are still a lot of influences from outside. And once again, Bulgaria's geographic situation is not an easy one. Where do you see Bulgaria moving, if at all, after these elections? And that was, I think, the Jan's question. Are the elections result? Are they going to have any incidence on the elections, and who eventually gets in power as well?
Well, this is I mean, essentially, you cannot underestimate Russia's influence in Bulgaria. It's been there for many decades and years, and nobody has ever done anything about it in earnest. And I think Borisov also chose that easier path, essentially, not to lead but to follow. The Bulgarian population is one of the most pro-Russian and pro-Putin globally, and this is part of historical language and other reasons, but it's also part of very poor management. I mean, essentially, there is no Bulgarian party, except Da Bulgaria maybe, that clearly outlines the Bulgarian public interest in favor of Euro-Atlantic integration. Borisov, of course, and the Turkish Minority Party, they've also played along, saying very clearly that they're staunch supporters of the Euro-Atlantic integration, but they've looked at it from a transactional point of view, and that is very clear. I mean, in Borisov's case, he chose the way of what most of the Western Balkans have already chosen, and what Vučić is trying to perfect is essentially the balancing act. Not realizing that once you're a member of the EU and NATO, probably balancing act is not the best policy that you might choose. He clearly decided to play along and become Putin's person in the country. So he clearly became the person to talk to for Russia in the country, and he guaranteed and built Turk Stream for Russia. This was very, very clear. At the same time, outside of Borisov, there is nobody, the president, the socialists, the so-called nationalists, 2/3 of them were essentially pro-Russian nationalists, which is very, very peculiar for Bulgaria. Some of them were like Ataka were funded by Russia. So it's very interesting. The same attitude as to Putin, Borisov does with Erdogan. I mean, he essentially makes friends with him. He's no doubt about it. He's very, very close to him. He used that position to kind of work with, kind of bring him to the European Union and so on and so forth. Help some deals, but again, it was against the basic values. I mean, Bulgaria gave to Turkey several people that allegedly participated in the coup attempt without court decision. So this was really, one of the lowest lows in a way. So I think in that respect, Borisov actually pushed this further, and essentially in Bulgaria, nobody did anything about Russian disinformation. I mean, one of the things that CSD has found out in its most recent analysis, for example, is that the Russian embassy is most active in Bulgaria, its Facebook page. I mean, we found out that there are all sorts of Russian disinformation channels in the country, including national newspapers, including papers and outlets that are considered mainstream by the population and that actually peddle Russian and Chinese disinformation, without any stoppage in that. So Borisov never took a step to stem that flow, and as a result, as I said, Bulgarians are among the have the highest, I think, in excess of 70% approval of Putin, which is extreme, which is enormous. And in that respect, of course, there is also the economic dependency, oil and gas. I mean, essentially, think about it. Since 2009, when Russia cut off supplies to Bulgaria in the middle of winter, Bulgaria still hasn't built the interconnector to Greece, but it has built Turk Stream with its own money. So that is amazing, I should say, in terms of foreign policy orientation. Now, to the new parties, things are very clear. I can see there are many questions. As I said, Trifonov is not a newbie, in that respect. He clearly was friends and very close with both Borisov and the Turkish minority party. So he knows all the backdoor channels of business dealings in Bulgaria, and he knows that many of these lead to Russia. And he certainly is a populist, as was mentioned, he certainly appeals to, the vaccines and stuff like that. But I should say that there is a difference as being a showman on a show and how you're judged once you're in politics. I think we will very, very soon realize what he stands about. One thing is clear, though, that with Borisov aside, Bulgaria's future orientation is very unclear, meaning that with the exception of the Bulgaria, all the other parties could be assumed to be pro-Russian, or at least to don't mind doing business with Russia, absolutely not caring about what the consequences might be. So in that respect, I think it is extremely difficult to predict that things are going to be better. Essentially, I think the reason many people trusted Borisov was that he could manage that relation. In a way he did, but he could. Now it's unclear whether Bulgaria could withstand Russian pressure, just like it happened with the previous cabinet of Orešarski, which was a minority cabinet between the Socialist Party in 2014, in 2013, 2014, between the Socialist Party and the Turkish Minority Party, when they formed a joint venture with Gazprom to build South Stream, and when essentially Bulgaria bought also finally the reactors, or committed to them. So I think we are in a much more precarious position now in terms of lack of clarity as to how exactly things are going to play out in that respect.
Okay, thank you, Ruslan. I see that there are some questions that have arrived. I have one last question, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. North Macedonia and the results of the elections, because I think the two are linked, and I think this is an interesting thing to look at a little bit, for at least for the next 2-3 minutes. So, for the past few years, after having supported North Macedonia's integration into Euro-Atlantic structures, and during the European presidency of Bulgaria, the government actually supported a deal between Greece and North Macedonia on the name issue, so that basically North Macedonia could join NATO. And then, we started to get into the negotiations with the EU. First, the troublesome partner was France, and then it was Bulgaria. And what was said at the time was that Boyko Borisov was answering to pressures from his coalition partners in the nationalist right, who were into government, who he needed into government to govern the country. Now there is no more this nationalist right is gone. What does that mean for the foreign policy of Bulgaria and its stance on North Macedonia? There was actually a question from my colleague Paul McCarthy, who was asking, is Trifonov going to take the mantle of these nationalist parties in order to gain more votes, or is it going to be something else? I'd love to have your insights on this, and then I will open the floor to questions. And please continue to write your questions in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I have a specific view on North Macedonia's debacle in Borisov's policy. I think there was no policy. I think essentially that's the issue with Borisov. I mean, managing or governing by chaos. And this particular aspect was also very visible. I mean, the policy that Bulgaria has followed never changed. I mean, essentially, it's been one and the same towards North Macedonia on these particular issues for many, many, many years. And I don't think that it will change, because in order to change, there is a need for political leadership. And Borisov didn't play that. He didn't care, essentially. And that's very visible in the way how Bulgaria arrived at this veto of North Macedonia. Nobody understood why and when, but everybody that has followed this closely knew that this would have been coming. Now, Borisov, in that respect, Borisov politically, I think, is a very shrewd opponent. Some predicted 4 years ago, he would strangle and get rid of the nationalists. And this is exactly what he did, one by one. Essentially, he got them out of government and out of parliament, which he he also did with the previous reincarnations of Da Bulgaria. He's very good at that, suffocating by embracing. That said, I don't see in this new parliament that there will be any change in Bulgaria's foreign policy position. I mean, essentially, there is a very deeply ingrained understanding in Bulgarian population about what North Macedonia is and how Bulgaria's position in that respect is. And I think it will be even more difficult with a atomized parliament to see that, let alone knowing also that Trifonov would gladly play that populist sentiment. The socialists would also not go there because they risk losing further support. And Da Bulgaria would probably also not want to even touch it with a poke because it wants to sustain its support. So I think in that respect, we're not going to see any change in policy. Whether Trifonov is going to replace, I don't think, the thing about Trifonov is that we don't know what he stands for. I could certainly say that he's a populist. He doesn't have experience. He won't. I mean, there is no deep policy thinking and understanding and analysis and capacity to do that. You know, that's very clear and that's visible. So in that respect, I don't expect anything, you know, positive. You know, the only thing that I hope for is that they manage to do the crisis right, the pandemics right, just because there is so much pressure right now from the people. But otherwise, you know, leadership, that is something very off the radar, I think.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ruslan. And as promised, I think we're going to open up questions to our guests. Thank you very much for joining in and for asking your question. You still have time to ask questions. I'm going to try to get some of them. So we have one question from Mr. Schlager. Any guess where the voters who had previously supported the extreme right went? Thank you very much.
Well,
so yeah, that's interesting, the dynamics, the electoral dynamics, who voted for whom, or where the vote transfers were. And I might add, where did the vote transfers from the GER people, did that go straight into, I think also from the mainstream parties, they all go to Trifonov, or was there more dynamics?
Well, Trifonov certainly got the votes of those, you know, extreme. So this needs to. I mean, I would say Bulgarian nationalists, besides being, you know, what we call business parties, so essentially being in power for the, you know, for the business of power, they, you know, they didn't manage to design any sort of patriotic nationalism that is different from the extreme right, xenophobic, you know, misogynist. There was nothing really constructive in their position. People saw Ataka, for example, as a purely, you know, they got their money, they got their business, you know, and they get out of parliament. The same thing for the National Salvation Front, which was probably the one with the most vision about doing something. VMRO is in the same way. I mean, why would Bulgaria so suddenly look at the debacle on North Macedonia? I mean, this was clearly something that should have been done much more. Should have been much better designed. So this is very clear that they didn't manage this right. So people essentially voted for the nationalists as a form of previously as a form of voting against Borisov in previous elections. So voting against the establishment. Trifonov now took this role. So I wouldn't really put him, because people don't know him. He's of course a populist nationalist, but he's nowhere near the xenophobic, the misogynist, you know, kind of type of nationalists that we've seen in, you know, the extreme, very pro-Russian type of nationalists that we've seen in the other parties. So he's rather, again, he got the vote, the protest vote. He didn't say anything. People, essentially, you don't know what he is. You know, if you don't know him personally, if you don't know his history, you don't know what he stands for. He has 10 points that he cannot, you know, in 80% of that he cannot do in a normal parliament. And that's it. He didn't say anything. He was just concerting and all the time, you know, just complaining about, venting frustration about what the government didn't do and didn't do. So that's his. And that's how he got votes from Borisov, from the nationalists and from the socialists, and actually he took from everyone. But mostly these were the young people, you know, and that's surprising. You know, the young people between 18 and 30, he's the first power there, and of course the people that are outside of the country. So in that respect, he has a different voter profile than the nationalist parties. A lot of the outflow from the socialists actually came from the fact that older generations didn't vote because they were afraid of COVID, and because the election date was chosen so that, I mean, it was not chosen, but it coincided with the third wave. So people just didn't show up. So I think this explains the dynamics. I don't think there is, Trifonov was just lucky. He didn't say anything, he didn't do anything, he just did a party and that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruslan. I have actually an interesting follow-up. I take this as a follow-up question from Elizabeth Chavdarska. What do you think the second place of Slavy Trifonov means for the electoral views of Bulgarians, and why a larger part of the electorate voted for him instead of the other opposition party, Yes Bulgaria? And I think it's quite interesting, right? Because it's a great question, I think, personally, because with Da Bulgaria, you actually knew what you were going to get. There's a clear policy. There's a clear foreign policy orientation. Is it because they were too detailed on what they wanted to do that they didn't make it first, or is it a question of personality? I mean, this opens up so many questions about politics in general, but it would be great to have your thoughts about, how specifically in the Bulgarian context, this difference between Slavy Trifonov and Da Bulgaria, where this difference in the results comes from.
It is a very, very also depressing question, of course, to answer. Because it means that, well, of course, young people, they're inexperienced and they vote for whatever they like, so for whatever they see. And in this case, they just see nothing. They just see a show person. We've seen this in Italy with Pepe Grillo. We've seen this in other places, but it never ended up, well. The thing is, if one looks at the genesis of Trifonov, he's just like the former king or Borisov. People look at him as a messiah, and I think this is one of the issues with the Bulgarian Bulgarians voting. They somehow believe that politics could churn out a miracle, which of course could happen. But looking at the history of Trifonov and how deeply involved he is with all these business circles that Borisov is involved with, or the Socialists are involved with, or the Turkish Minority Party, or the so-called establishment parties are involved with, and looking at the complete lack of any clarity about what are they going to do with anything. Well, essentially, the only things that they said firmly that they're going to do, like reforming the voting system, they cannot do. And any person who can read can actually very quickly find this out. And this also means, by the way, that of course there is lack of sophistication within the system. So people do not actually vote for ideas and do not vote for programs, but vote for emotions, which of course we've known. And clearly in this respect, Trifonov has been the most kind of shrewd campaigner, and he is shrewd in that. I mean, I remember his business for 15 years. He has been in prime time in one of the most watched, not in one of the most, but the most watched national TV station. So he knows the audience, he knows how to connect with the audience. So he clearly read that. But the fact is that he doesn't have any idea of, and I'm afraid if one has to be very cool-headed, this cannot end really well. Although we hope that there will be, all these methods that I mentioned. Bulgaria, if one reads the Bulgaria 2030, let's say, national reform program, which is the main document that Bulgaria is going to use to manage EU funds, you will see it's a very depressing read. A severe demographic downturn, corruption, incapacity, lack of labor force, aging population. You name it, you have it. It's the worst performer throughout the EU. So you need a very solid, very capable, very visionary person to actually take the country outside of that. So Bulgaria hasn't really shown, I mean, like a star in any of the years since 1989, if you think about it. And people somehow think that this will happen with a miracle. You know, it will not happen with a rational voting behavior. So that's why essentially we've seen again this surprise voting and surprise results.
Thanks, Ruslan. I'd like to ask you a follow-up question on this, because we seem to be focusing a lot on the new kids on the block, so to speak. And yet there is one person that we have barely talked about in this during this this talk, and that's Boyko Borisov. And Borisov, we seem to be dismissing Borisov as part of the past. Is that really the case? I mean, the guy got 25% of the votes, biggest party in parliament. He still has a lot of the keys. There really no path for him to get back to the prime ministership. But I understand that, you know, a lot of the parties, if not almost all of the parties, have basically said, you know, no, we're not going to go into coalition with Boyko Borisov. But I was having a chat as part of our podcast series, Think Atlantic, with Daniel Mitov, who is former foreign minister of Bulgaria and was running with Gerbdissan. And he was saying, well, you know, there's what you say before the election and what you do after the election. Are we underestimating Boyko Borisov's survival capacities?
Well, I think not. You know, Borisov has shown that he's a survivor. He's a shrewd operator. He's by far the most experienced, both in Bulgaria and internationally. He knows that. And he also knows that he has done a lot of good things for the country too. I mean, all these 26% of the people, it's not these, as many people say, it's not just clientele. You know, in the end of the day, if you look at, you know, if you look at the performance of Bulgaria, it hasn't been, you know, it hasn't been shining, but it hasn't also been in doldrums. You know, it's essentially we've been, you know, 5th, 6th place in Central and Eastern Europe. So in that respect, you know, you could say, well, you know, he certainly did deliver on some of that, including the banking union, including some other stuff. So, but at the same time, he does appear to be also a little bit worn out. But I don't think he's down. You know, I think anyone that thinks of underestimating him would be doing so at his own or her own peril, because he has shown that he could come back in a matter of weeks. He knows that in politics, events matter, and these events sometimes could turn around elections or sentiments in a matter of weeks. This is what he did essentially last time when he seized upon in the European elections and in the last parliamentary elections. He seized upon Cornelia Ninova's too heavy insistence on being pro-Russian, and he essentially won on a pro-Euro-Atlantic campaign. And people got scared and they voted for him. You know, so I think he clearly understands the odds are stacked against him, and he will be very difficult to kind of get around. And I think he understands that he knows that it will be very difficult for this parliament to form a functioning cabinet. And the minute he gets out of power, he will start, of course, you know, playing his role in terms of, look, I'm here, I know what I'm doing. And also, he has always played politically very strongly. You know, he always says, which is true, whenever there is something that shows that there is corruption within GERB, I get rid of the people. You know, he's the prime minister that didn't, you know, that got rid of, you know, 6 ministers in his last cabinet. His second in command, Ruslan Stefanov. So he clearly shows resolve in that respect. So those 26% are not, as many people would say, just clientele. So we should definitely not rule Borisov out. I mean, given that he has also appointed each and every person in the judiciary, in all the regulatory bodies, and of course he's done many more appointments. I think that he's a mainstay, and it will be and it will be very difficult to follow the fate of his former boss, the former Bulgarian king. So I think we will see him around.
Indeed, and if we're going also into elections in 6 months, we'll also see how that plays out. There's obviously a lot of unknowns here. We have time for a couple other questions. I have one from Svetoslav Beglita, which I think is super interesting. Lately in March, we saw that the Bulgarian Prosecutor's Office announced that after a police and counterintelligence operation in Sofia, a Russian spy ring, including Bulgarian officials, was blown and broken up. Do you think it was intentionally done before the elections in order to influence citizens, and how could it impact further relations, perceptions towards Russia? So, I mean, we will never know, right, to what extent this was organized or it was part of a PR operation, but it did happen, and the Russians seem to not be happy with with this dismantlement of this spy ring. How I mean, is this going? Are we going just to move on, or is this going to have further impact on the relationship with Russia and also on perceptions about Russia?
Well, it's a third such action, but people are right to be skeptical, and this definitely I would also discount it as a pre-election maneuver. And it's rather for external consumption than for internal one, because Bulgarians are very skeptical about that. They know that Borisov has played alone with the Russians and Putin, and he has been with Turk Stream essentially has been doing business, very quick, fast, efficient business. So in that respect, this is very clear, and actually he has not been alone. The Socialists, the Turkish minority party. Remember, they changed their leader because they supported the downing of the Russian airplane, by Turkey. So actually they didn't support it, but they took the side of Turkey instead of Russia, or instead of staying silent. And remember, Bulgaria was one of the few, if not the only EU country that didn't expel diplomats because of the Skripal. So it didn't go along with its EU partners. And at the same time, if we look at the vulnerabilities the Bulgaria faces from Russian espionage, they're huge. They've been there for decades. We've never investigated the links of the former Bulgarian Secret Service and the Russian Secret Service. And there are now tens of people within the current parliament. There were tens of people within the previous parliament. Only that Bulgaria essentially got rid of these people. So once again, you cannot underestimate that. I think this is just scratching the surface. I don't think this is serious. I mean, I don't see any. It's all situational. I don't see any strategy, any idea about what is the Bulgarian interest, how do we define it, and how do we uphold it vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis Turkey, let's say. That we haven't seen. We don't know what it is.
Okay, we have still 1 minute, so I'm going to ask the one last question and ask you, Ruslan, to provide a very short answer. A question from Graham Scott from IRI. What are some initial steps a new government could take to improve, strengthen anti-corruption institutions in Bulgaria? I know that the subject is huge, but we have only 1 minute. So in a nutshell, what is your political program to root out corruption in Bulgaria?
Well, essentially, a new government needs to kick the institutions to start working. Bulgaria has the institutions to do that, but they need to have a clear mandate, a clear idea of performance indicators. So where do they want to go? And primarily look at the top shelf. Start at the top. So if I were a new government, I would definitely want to go there. And number two, if I may add, they need to do that in cooperation with the EU. I think the external anchor, the external conditionality, even if you want, is very, very important, because I don't think there is capacity within any government and within the administration to do that themselves alone. So I think a very clear anchoring and work and commitment, shared commitment with the European Commission and with the European partners could do the trick.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruslan. And we are just at 6:30 exactly, and I know that we need to keep up the timing. And I also know that people also have a life that goes on outside of the internet. So thank you very much for all of you. We had a good participation, a very good participation ratings. Thank you very much for tuning in to this discussion. I hope that it allowed you to have a clearer idea of what exactly has been going on and how Bulgaria will move forward, although we're still pretty unsure about what is going to come next, as you were able to hear. But at least I hope this has enlightened you on what the path is moving forward. Thanks everybody for moving in. Thank you very much to Joanna Rohozinska and the Beacon team for organizing with our IRI's communication team in DC this dialogue, and we hope to be back with you very soon for more webinars. Thank you very much, and look forward to talk to you soon. And thank you, Ruslan, for...
Thanks, Thibault. And follow the Beacon project. This is where we'll be coming up with more updates. And of course, I'll be happy to answer any of your questions if you follow up through CSD's webpage. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And don't forget to tune into our websites to get out more information about the Beacon project and about the International Republican Institute's efforts to promote democracy around the world. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.